Hello and welcome to a fresh installment of the Taseel podcast. I am Saad Ismail and our guest today is Professor Anantanand Rambachan. We'll be discussing primarily his book, The Advaita Worldview, God, World and Humanity. A brief introduction to the professor. Professor Anantanand Rambachan is Professor of Religion, Philosophy and Asian Studies at St. Olaf College. His books include Accomplishing the Accomplished, The Vedas as a Source of Valid Knowledge in Shankara, The Limits of Scripture, Vivekananda's Reinterpretation of the Vedas, The Advaita Worldview, God, World, and Humanity, A Hindu Theology of Liberation, and Essays in Hindu Theology. Professor Rambachan has been involved in interreligious relations and dialogue for over 25 years as a Hindu contributor and analyst. He is active in the dialogue programs of the World Council of Churches and was a Hindu guest and presenter in 4 General Assemblies of the World Council of Churches. He's also involved in the consultations of the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue at the Vatican and currently participates as a Hindu theologian in the Ethics in Action dialogues at the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. Professor Anant serves as an advisor to the Pluralism Project at Harvard University. He's a member of the International Advisory Council for the Tony Blair Faith Foundation and a member of the Theological Education Committee of the American Academy of Religion. Professor Anant, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your generous time.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Ismail. It's a joy and honor to join you for this discussion. And thank you so much for your interest in my work, in my writing. I appreciate that very much.
Thank you. So, Professor, I suppose my initial question to you would be, looking at your book, The Advaita Worldview, you talk about the human problem, and we talk about the various limitations of our quest. For example, our quest for knowledge has certain limitations, our quest for wealth, quest for pleasure. And the limited nature of all of these quests leads us ultimately desiring for something higher than these things. And that is where the Vedantic wisdom comes to offer us a way. Could you please talk about that? What is the need for this, and what is the human problem in the first place?
So thank you for that question, Dr. Ismail. I think that, and here we are speaking in a very specific way about the Vedanta tradition, the Hindu Vedanta tradition, and even more specifically about the non-dual tradition, which is in Sanskrit is spoken of as Advaita. So we're speaking about Advaita Vedanta, which is a tradition based primarily on interpretations of the final sections of the Vedas, which of course are the Upanishads. Now, I often think, that about religion, that a good question is, what is the problem for which, let's say, God is the answer, or God is your answer? What is the problem for which God is your answer? It's a good way to engage in thinking about what you call the human problem. What is the dilemma that you are seeking to resolve by your turn towards any particular religion? So, when I study the Upanishads and the writings of Advaita teachers, what I see is a description of a human problem that is easily recognizable. I think it is not a problem that has to be posited hypothetically, but it's a problem that we can all recognize in one way or the other in our own life experiences. And I think also that is a problem that is recognized across the religious traditions. And so in the Upanishads, the religious quest starts in earnest, starts in sincerity, starts in depth, when we come to experience that as important as, gains in life, such as wealth or sense pleasure or fame, etc., as much as these are necessary and even important, that they fail to satisfy us. We are still in a condition of want. We're in a condition of inadequacy. The tradition, let me say, as I say in my writings, the tradition is not anti-materialistic, even though some people might represent it in that way. It does not regard material necessities as somehow intrinsically flawed, and pleasure also. After all, in the broader Hindu tradition, wealth, which is in Sanskrit artha, and pleasure, which is karma, are life goals. They are commended. But the problem is that when we don't appreciate the limitations of these limitations, in the sense that they as human beings we need more. They leave us dissatisfied. They leave us wanting. So we find that in the Upanishads there are so many encounters of people coming to teachers, basically stating in some form or the other, in spite of all of these achievements, in spite of my wealth, in spite of my pleasurable life, I am in sorrow. I am in Dukha. I am unhappy. What is it that is missing? What is it that is lacking? What is the source of this deep internal unhappiness? The Buddha also spoke of it as Dukha, this suffering that I continue to experience. So in our tradition, Dr. Ismail, when one comes to this point in one's life, we are advised to go to a teacher, and in a relationship with the teacher, become a disciple of a teacher. The qualified teacher is described in the tradition, and you go to a teacher to seek a solution to this problem of want, this problem of inadequacy, this problem of dissatisfaction, the desire for more. What is that? What is that more that we are seeking?
The example which you were giving, the one where Narada comes to his teacher, Sanat Kumara, and what I find really fascinating about that example is that it's in the context of knowledge.
Yes.
Something such as knowledge, and something being master of so many knowledge. You still are left with sorrow, and you still are left with this existential yearning. So there's something beyond a certain lower level of knowledge that you're seeking. There's a certain higher knowledge that you want.
Yes. And I'm so happy you remember that example of Narada, who was such an accomplished person in his own time.
Yes. I'm just saying that please feel free to use any technical terms if you want, because that gives us a good anchor to think about these terms and these concepts.
Yes. Thank you for that. Now I'm particularly happy that you remembered the encounter between Narada and his teacher Sanat Kumara, and this is in the Chandogya Upanishad, which is it's a very beautiful dialogue. And as you said, Narada was perhaps he was a Renaissance person in his own time, in that he had mastered so many scholarly disciplines. But he goes to his teacher and he gives a long list of all that he has studied, all of the forms of knowledge that he mastered. But he comes at the end of it and he says to him, but I am in sorrow. I am in sorrow, which means he's identifying a deep lack or want within him. And so he comes out of a discovery of the limits of what he knows. And as you hinted in your in the way you frame the question in your reference to Narada and Sanat Kumara, the Upanishads themselves, speak of two kinds of knowledge, para vidya and apara vidya. Now, I don't, sometimes, these terms are translated in ways that I find to be misleading. So apara is translated as lower knowledge and para as higher knowledge. But I think of apara knowledge as knowledge that pertains to our understanding of the world in which we live. For example, scientific inquiry would be apara vidya. It's an important form of inquiry that helps us to understand cause-effect relationships in the world. So, for example, we are right now in the midst of this terrible pandemic that is throwing our lives into chaos. And we seek knowledge about this virus, understanding how it operates, what is its nature, in order to find a solution for it. We inquire by using reason and cause-effect relationships. This is paravidya. It's very important. It is necessary for good dignified human living in this world. But our traditions also tell us that there is another form of knowledge, which it calls paravidya. It calls paravidya because it's knowledge about that which is para, that which is ultimate. In Sanskrit, of course, we speak of that as Brahman. So the knowledge of Brahman is called paravidya, knowledge of the ultimate, which relates also to who we are. Because Sanat Kumara in that dialogue you mentioned with Narada says, your sorrow, the root of your sorrow is that you don't know who you are. You don't know, you don't know yourself, the truth of your own human nature. And for that you need a different kind of knowledge. He doesn't condemn what Narada studied and learned, but he pointed to its limits. And I say that because in some of your preliminary remarks before we entered into our conversation, you referenced or you spoke about the use of reason and the relationship between reason and religion, or reason and spirituality. And for me, that's a very significant issue. And this is why I am emphasizing that the kinds of disciplines that Narada mastered are very important, right, because they're the disciplines where we exercise reason, and we should not negativize reason, but we should also understand that reason is one way of inquiring, one way of seeking truth, and we should not also absolutize reason as the only way of understanding reality. It's an important, it has its own methods, but it also has its own limits. And I would say the same in a different way also, Dr. Ismail, for spirituality or religion more broadly speaking, that that method of inquiry also has its own limits. In this tradition, the Advaita Vedanta tradition, the purpose of a religious text, the purpose of a sacred text, in our case, an Upanishad, which are part of the Vedas, is not to tell us, for example, about history. Right? There is the discipline of historical inquiry for that. The purpose of a sacred text is to tell us to impart some knowledge that we cannot gain through other means of knowing. In other words, it does not duplicate what is the proper field of another way of inquiry. So I think that's important, and that's highlighted in this encounter between Narada and Sanat Kumara that you referenced.
Yes. What's also important is that the nature of the reality that we are seeking, beyond the material or beyond wealth and pleasure and all those things, the nature of the ultimate reality that we're seeking, the ultimate self, its nature is, again, because it is beyond all these things, therefore it cannot be known through our usual means of knowing things,
Yes.
our usual modes of perception.
Yes.
So we need a source that is different. We need a revelation or a scripture for that.
Yes, yes. So that's a very important point, and that, as you know, because you have read so many of my writings, and again, as I said, I deeply value your interest. This has been at the center of a lot of my work, and my first book, which is called Accomplishing the Accomplished, the Vedas as a source of valid knowledge in Shankara, who was the primary commentator or systematizer, I would put it, of the non-dual Advaita tradition. This was the focus of that book. So in this tradition, we speak of pramana. A pramana in Sanskrit is a source of valid knowledge. So the word prama is knowledge, and that from which we get valid knowledge is called a pramana. So all of the traditions, including the Advaita tradition, must list, are asked to list what do you consider, what does this tradition consider to be a valid source of knowledge? So that's the foundation for good discussion, for good dialogue. Because if we are having a dialogue and we have different authoritative sources, then our dialogue does not go very, very far. You know, you will quote your authoritative source, I will quote my authoritative source, and we have no point where we meet. So it is traditional to list these valid sources of knowledge that include, you know, some of the well-known ones like perception, inference, etc., etc. And at the same time, as you said in your question, at the same time to acknowledge what are the limits of these different sources of knowledge. So let's take perception. In Sanskrit, we speak of perception as pratyaksha. It is a valid source of knowledge, right? It is a valid source of knowledge. We don't know, you know, the size or shape or color of things without perception. In fact, we develop instruments of different kinds to magnify the abilities of our senses. So this is what we do in the field of astronomy and so on. But perception has its limits. It can only deal with reality that is an object of perception. Something that I could see, something I could touch, something I can taste, something I can smell. So perception works as far as realities that are objects of perception are concerned. If there is a reality that is not an object of perception, then perception is, you know, it fails. It has its limits there. The same with inference. Inference is a valid source of knowledge, and the one, you know, has been used from classical times as the example is, you know, where there is smoke, there is fire. It's valid because we have seen all the time the relationship between smoke and fire. It's invariable. So when we see smoke and we say there is fire, it's valid because of this invariable relationship between smoke and fire. But, you know, inference depends, the validity of an inference depends on the perceptual data on which it is based. It's as good as perception. So these are valid, they are important, but they are limited because they can only tell us about certain kinds of reality. And so Brahman, the absolute, the ultimate, as we learn in the Upanishads, it is not an object of perception. And the reason behind it, dear Dr. Ismail, is I regard as very obvious in so many ways, that if Brahman is infinite, infinite, without going into all the intricacies of what it means to describe the ultimate as infinite, but minimally we can say that if it is infinite, it is not an object in space. It is not one object among other objects. The infinite cannot be an object in space, because then it is in space, within space. It is limited, it is constricted, it has boundaries. So logically, it is not an object. And if it is not an object, then it cannot be known through the methods that are useful and relevant and applicable for knowing those things that are objects. So as you said, we need a different pramana. And this is the argument, this is the rationale for the sacred text. In our case, for the Upanishads, that it is through these words of the Upanishads that we come to understand, to learn about the nature of the absolute, the nature of Brahman, that is not available or accessible to other forms of knowing. But at the same time, let me add, Dr. Ismail, that what we know about the nature of Brahman from the Upanishads should not and ought not to be in conflict with what we know about reality from other sources of knowledge. So I don't know if you recall, I quote very often a section of the commentary of Shankara on the 18th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, where he says, if 100 verses of the Vedas told you that fire is cold, you are under no obligation to accept that as true. Perhaps the text has some other reason for saying that, but it would so obviously contradict another valid source of knowledge that you're not under an obligation to accept that as true.
Yeah, I think there are so many interesting directions we can take this discussion. For example, I'm thinking about scripture as pramana,
Yes.
and as a source of knowledge, and particularly because the nature of the reality that we seek to know is such that it is only through such a means that we can know it. And in this context, you make a point, you actually say that Shankaracharya makes this point, that scripture itself is a direct means of knowledge.
Yes, that's correct. So here we get into a Saad, the difference between a direct and an indirect means of knowledge. So let me explain by using an example. If, let's say let's say I'm a very good chef and I have very good recipes, and you are interested in learning, how to make a special dish that I have expertise in, and you come to me and you said, please share with me your knowledge of this special recipe. Then I will give you the details of the recipe. These are the ingredients that you need to acquire, Saad, and then this is the method that you must use to prepare these ingredients, and at the end of it you will have a dish. Hopefully it will come out very, very well and it will be delicious, a meal that you prepared. So I give you the knowledge of the recipe, and then I tell you how to implement it, and then you have the result, and the result will be sometime in the future. When I tell you the recipe and I tell you what to do, the result is not immediate. You have to do something with that knowledge, and then with some time lapse or some time gap, you will produce the result. So that in that sense, knowledge is indirect, because the object of knowledge, let us say the object of knowledge is the dish that you want to prepare. The object of knowledge is not immediately available. Something has to be done to bring it into being, to create it. It is not immediately there. It has to be created by some appropriate action. So knowledge has to be implemented in some act in order to produce a result which is non-existent. It has to be brought into being in time. So that would be an example of indirect knowledge. Now, as far as direct knowledge is concerned, Shankara gives many examples in his commentaries. The one that I shared in my writings that you would have read, he tells the famous story of the 10th person. You'll recall that, where you had these 10 disciples who went on a hike, and then they came to a river that was in flood. They entered into the river. When they got on the opposite bank, they wanted to be sure that they had all arrived safely. And so the leader did a count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and concluded that the 10th person was missing. The 10th person was lost, that he was swept away in the river. So they were all full of sorrow. They had lost their friend. They sat in a desolate state on the bank of the river until a woodcutter was returning home after his labor in the forest and saw this group of students and inquired about their dilemma and about the cause of their sorrow. So they explained what had happened, and he said, okay, let me take a look at how you concluded that the 10th person was lost. And so he asked the leader to do the count again, and he did the count in the woodcutter's presence. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. He said, see, we were 10 and now we are only 9. And then, of course, you know the clinching statement of the woodcutter is that you are the 10th man. You are the 10th person. The moment he said that, the problem was resolved. The problem, the knowledge was direct. Why? Because the 10th person was not really lost. The 10th person was always available. It was an error in the way in which they counted. So when we are speaking about a reality that is immediately available, not separate from us by space or by time, in the case of the recipe, the dish that you want to prepare is separate from you by time because something has to be done to make it happen, to bring it into existence. In the case of the story of the 10th person, the important point about the story is that the 10th person is immediately available. He's there. He's not separate by time or by space, but there was a misunderstanding in the mind of the leader that has to be corrected. And so this misunderstanding is what in Sanskrit we speak of as avidya, as ignorance, right? So when the words, you are the 10th person was said, immediately he got it. The 10th person was found. Applying or extending that analogy, let me just conclude this point, Saad, extending this analogy to where you are truly asking me, the point is that which we are seeking, the ultimate Brahman, is here and now. It is not separate from us. We don't have to go somewhere in space to find Brahman somewhere else. And we don't have to wait in terms of time that Brahman will somehow, Brahman is not here and now, but in the future Brahman will be. There is no separation. between ourselves and Brahman. And so, but there is the problem of avidya. We don't recognize what is right here and now. We don't recognize. And this is where, to connect this question with the previous question that you asked me, Saad, this is where the pramana comes into being. So in that case, the woodcutter served as a sort of a pramana, an authoritative source who solved the problem. In this case, we have the teaching of the scripture, which is given to us by the teacher, and that's the source of the knowledge that dispels the ignorance about the nature of Brahman.
Right.
That's direct knowledge. There's so much more to say about it, but that's in gist form.
Of course,
but
no, I think that's beautifully encapsulated in that. And I think what your title of the first book was about, accomplishing the accomplished.
Yes.
Is
So
it
I
easy to
use that
translate?
title. Yes, I use that title because, again, that title is connected so well with your question about direct and indirect knowledge. So in the case of, making a cake or making a dish, that would be accomplishing something that is not yet accomplished, because that dish has to be brought into being. But in the case of the story of the 10th man, the 10th person, it's accomplishing the accomplished. In other words, the 10th person was there all along. And what was necessary was the removal of ignorance, removal of avidya, and the discovery of it. Is like, I wear glasses, and I always, from time to time, have the experience of thinking that I lost my glasses, and I'm looking on the desk for it, and then, oh, it's not. I have it. It's on my face. So when it's never lost. Once I realize, oh, I have it, it's immediately. It's because it's always there.
Of course, yeah. I think in Sanskrit that would be praptasya prapta.
Correct. So we have, yes, exactly. So yeah, praptasya prapti, praptasya prapti. Yeah, gaining that which is gain, or gaining that which is not yet gained.
I think this leads us to ask, if this is the case, and if Brahman is always here and now, what is the nature of our existence, of our reality, that makes us miss this point, that keeps us in illusion? I think this is a good segue to get into a discussion about, is this all really an illusion, or what is the reality of the world of appearances?
It's an important question, Saad, because and you would probably have a good intimation of this from reading my writings, that while you do have a whole history of interpretations of Advaita that describe the world or use the language of illusion, which is what you just use. I'm not saying that you hold that view, but that's a very popular view that describes the world as an illusion. And the most popular example in these writings is the one that likens the world to like a sense illusion that we project and we experience because of our ignorance. You probably heard or read the analogy of the rope and the snake. That's a well-known analogy where the world is compared to a snake, but where the reality is really the rope. And so when you know the rope, the snake no longer exists. The snake vanishes because it was a projection of your mind. It's a subjective projection. And that way of speaking about the nature of the world is one that I disagree with. And even I go back to Shankara, and it's clear, that he's more complex on this issue than he's often made out to be, because he's often represented as someone who champions the view of the world as an illusion, when I think that the reality is more complex and perhaps even more interesting than that. About the commentaries and the arguments back and forth, let me, very briefly say, that Shankara does not describe the world as an illusory projection of the human mind. Because he says that, external things are perceived as a matter of fact. In fact, because they are established by valid sources of knowledge, by pramana. Because of pratyaksha, we know the world is external, right? And it is not something that, even for the liberated person, the one who comes to know the nature of Brahman, the world does not disappear. He or she still lives in the world, eats, drinks, walks, talks, converses. If it was an entirely subjective projection, it will disappear as the snake disappears when you know the rope. But that is not how it happens. He does not equate our experiences in the waking state with the dream. There is a difference for Shankara between waking and dream state, because when we wake up from dream, then the dream world is, it is negated, it is sublated, it disappears when we awake. But the objects that we experience in the waking state don't disappear, because they are established to be so on the basis of a valid source of knowledge. So the world exists both for the liberated person. In Sanskrit, we say the jivan mukta, the living liberated, and the world also exists for the person who is not liberated. The difference is not whether the world exists or doesn't exist, but how we see that world, the nature of the world. So for the unliberated person, the world is seen as different from and separate from the ultimate reality, from Brahman. And for those who are liberated, the world exists, but the world is seen as inseparable from that one, from that ultimate reality. He said if liberation resulted in the annihilation of the world, this would have happened for the first person who attained liberation. So my interpretation on this issue is to speak about two different ways of seeing the world, not about the disappearance of the world as an illusion, but I speak of the transformation of our vision, our understanding of the world. And one last point on this question for me, from many, many reasons. It is at the heart also of this debate, and the question that you're raising here is important for me because it goes to the heart of my concern for social justice, my concern for activism in the world. And because I contend that in order that we have to take life in the world seriously. If we don't take life in the world seriously, we dismiss it as an illusion, then we are more likely not to take issues of justice and income disparity and hierarchical oppression seriously. Because there are people who would argue, why bother about these things? These are all part of the illusory world. But I locate this interpretation in my reading of Shankara, but also in the Upanishads, because the Upanishads themselves, Saad, never speak of the world as a subjective projection of the human mind. The language of illusion and so on is not Upanishadic. The Upanishads begin and speak of the origin of the many from the one, from that one source, from that one Brahman, as an intentional act of self-multiplication. So you find so many Upanishadic passages which begin by speaking, where Brahman, it sort of represents Brahman as undergoing, as engaged in this process of affirming, let me become many. Bahusyam prajayeti. Let me multiply myself, let me become many. So it's clear, if we do deep exegesis of such passages, the world is Brahman's world, or Ishvara's world. It is not our creation. That's why we can't treat it in the same way as an illusion that we could cause to vanish if it were our mental projection.
Right. I think you expressed this quite succinctly in a sentence where you say that vidya and avidya are at the level of epistemology, not at the level of ontology.
Yes.
So,
yes.
So when we are in ignorance or when we are enlightened,
yes,
it is our subjective change that is occurring over there, not external reality.
Yes, 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 yes. And, to use another common example, Saad, to make the same point, because it's also in the Upanishads, in Chandogya Upanishads, in fact, the example of, I'm sure you're familiar with this, the example of clay and clay pots, example of gold and gold ornaments are used. So for me, if I looked at the clay pot and I saw both pot and clay, I saw both. Clay is its ultimate nature, but I could see that clay as constituting the nature of all clay pots. But I could also see that each clay pot has a very distinctive nature. It is clay, but it's also clay in a very distinctive and beautiful form. I could see both. And I could appreciate both. In other words, in order to appreciate the ultimate reality, the ultimate nature of the clay pot, which is clay, I don't have the clay pot does not have to vanish from my sight. I can see both. I can value both. And so I think for me, this is also true of the world. When I look at, and if I look at any object in the world, I should see its rootedness, its groundness. I should see Brahman, as constituting the ontological nature of everything that is, every being that exists. But I don't have to, it doesn't require the disappearance of the many for me to appreciate the one. If I could see the many as expressions, beautiful expressions of that one. So the understanding of the one does not require the obliteration or the disappearance of the many. And that's where the rope snake analogy for me breaks down. To know the rope, the snake has to vanish because the snake is an individual private projection. The world is not our private projection. It is Brahman's creation. It's not a point that is often made in the interpretation of the Advaita tradition, but this is very important to me, Saad.
Would it be fair to say that if what we see is only the one, or all you see is the many and you're ignorant of the one, so you are in avidya? On another case, you see only the one and you don't see the many, or you don't appreciate the many. Would that also be another form of avidya? And vidya would be a position where you're able to see one in the many, or the many as the one?
I would put it that way. I would agree with you. I would agree with you. And as I said, for me, the importance of articulating it in the way that you just did, where you have the two extremes, where we see only the many, or let's say, we see only the one. I stand in a theological space where I see both the one and the many. That allows me, as I hinted earlier, Saad, to take the issues of the world and take the problems of the world seriously, and to engage with those problems. So that to engage with problems of, as I said, when people lack resources for dignified and decent living, and those resources include access to food and clothing and shelter and clean water and health resources and opportunities for knowledge and literacy. If I don't see the world, how will I even begin to engage those kinds of problems? And I should see also that those economic and other kinds of problems also have roots in certain kinds of understandings of ourselves. In other words, without dismissing the deep policy transformations that are required, it is also true that income inequality or caste hierarchy, if I would give that example, also have sources in flawed theological understandings or false knowledge of who we are and our relationship with others.
Right. You make this point that tradition has spoken of Dukha and suffering, but predominantly that discussion has been of the individual suffering. Whereas you say that potentially, in principle, at least, nothing is preventing you from translating it into social and systemic suffering.
Yes.
And that is what you're trying to address. Right?
Yes, son, that is quite true. And I think there are reasons for that. This is another interesting area of questioning that you are probing. When most of the commentators, let me step back a little bit, sir. Most of the commentators on the texts like the Upanishads are renunciants. In the Hindu tradition, I'm speaking about a sannyasin, someone who has entered the fourth stage, what we call the fourth stage of life, which is a formal entry into an order of life, a life stage, the order of becoming a sannyasin or sannyasini or renunciant. Now, this is quite a radical step. When one enters this fourth stage of life and took the vows of entering the fourth stage, one was required, you took a new name. In other words, you gave up an old identity completely, and you cut ties with society. Now, of course, sannyasins live different lifestyles, but traditionally, you would have completely disassociated yourself from family and community and from all the obligations that you were required to perform as a member of a family or as a member of a community. In fact, it was so radical, Saad, that the ritual of becoming a monk involved a step where you performed your own death ceremony, your own death ritual. So you were ritually and in so many ways practically dead to the world, and your interest was only in the pursuit of moksha or liberation. Now, think about it, Saad, when such a person who has severed all of his or her ties with community, with world, with even ritual life, came to read a text. And you know, what are this person's concerns? Only liberation, and liberation construed as liberation from this world. So the interpretations that are consequent of such an identity naturally would move in certain kinds of directions. Such people, that's why, you know, you're not mining the text or reading the text for resources to address significant problems in the world. The text no longer speaks to those kinds of issues. And I think that's a big part of the reason. Also, the major commentators that we have of the Upanishads are, you know, renunciant. Shankara himself was a renunciant, his disciples, and then you have a whole lineage of monastic interpretation of the text. I'm often, when I read an Upanishadic text, Saad, and I'm also reading the commentary of Shankara side by side, I'm often pausing and saying, oh, this verse, you know, is a wonderful resource for guiding my choices in relation to the world in this way. So if I read, for example, you know, the opening verse of Isha Upanishad, Isha Vasyam idam sarvam, yat kinchit jagatyam jagat, tena tyaktena bhunjita magrida kasya svidhanam, that the whole world should be seen as enfolded in God. Isha Vasyam, wrapped in the divine. Isha Vasyam idam sarvam. Whatever there is, yat kinchit jagatyam jagat, is enfolded, wrapped in God. Tena tyaktena bhunjita. Give up and enjoy, to not covet the wealth of another. So I then read that verse as affirming, you know, the worth of the world as enfolded in the divine, the dignity of every human being as held in divine embrace. And then that beautiful sentence, enjoy, give up and enjoy. Give up and enjoy. That the giving up there is not running away from the world, but a certain relationship with the world. And one should also still enjoy the life in the world, but without greed, Seeing it, when we see the world as enfolded in the divine, there's a deep joy. That we enjoy the world in a deep measure. It liberates us from greed. So the last sentence, you know, do not covet the wealth of another, is speaking about a transformation of human relationships. That we should, in other words, when you don't covet the wealth of another, you can rejoice in another's success. You know, you don't feel that somehow you are diminished because another one is successful, or another one has achieved a goal in life. So I am reading these texts, Saad, not as turning me away from the world, but as orienting me to a fuller and a deeper way of being in the world. You see what I mean? Yeah. Whereas if I was a renunciant, I probably would not be seeing that kind of potential in the text. So my point here is, you know, how we read our text is also informed, I think, by who we are. I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a teacher. I'm looking to my tradition, and I want to be deeply enriched by my tradition, but I want to be deeply enriched in all of these roles that I perform. And I don't think, you know, attaining the liberating vision of my tradition requires that I give up all of these roles. Certainly I should they would be transformed, but I don't have to turn away from them.
This also reminds me of another verse in the Bhagavad Gita where Krishna says, I am pleasure, which is not opposed to righteousness.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Avidha. Avidha, he used with avidha rupa. Kamosmi bharatarshava. That pleasure which is not opposed to ethics or dharma, I am. That's a very, for me, that's also a key text. That, and then you have all other verses, Saad, that are commending the beauty of this world. See me in the taste of water, see me in the light of the sun, see me in the fragrance of the earth. I don't read these as telling me, that somehow I must turn away from the world, that the world is somehow negativized. But telling me that, if I can see the world as infused by the divine, I can see the world infused by the divine. There is a profound appreciation of the world that follows from that vision. And so when I come to, read words like samsara, let's say, as an example, in the Hindu tradition, Saad, I read samsara because many again say that the world is samsara. And because samsara has come to take on negative meanings, the world itself is negativized when it is described as samsara. So again, I come back to an exegesis of words like samsara and other words as indicative of a certain attitude to the world, and not the world as world. So I don't think that this tradition problematizes the world as world. I think it problematizes seeing the world in a particular way and being in the world in a particular way. But the problem is not the world as world, even though there are interpretations that seem to suggest that the problem is the world as world. Does that make sense?
Yes. This goes back to our previous discussion that we were having about Brahman as the world. And part of the whole discussion is, of course, the hierarchy that is introduced between Nirguna and Saguna Brahman.
Yes.
And you want to distance the world from the ultimate reality, or from the higher Brahman.
Yes. So that's, again, all of these topics that you mentioning, and I'm glad you see them in that way, because I see them like you as interconnected. How we speak about the world is related also to how we speak about the nature of the divine, the nature of God. And so, there is a certain trend. If you read, widely Saad about the Advaita tradition, you will come across many interpretations that speak about the Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Brahman. And some even go as high, some even go to the extent of saying the Nirguna Brahman is the higher Brahman and Saguna Brahman is the lower Brahman. And so that's a hierarchy that also has become a part of the conventional discourse about the divine in the Advaita, and I would say in some of the other traditions associated with the larger Hindu tradition. Now, as you quite rightly note, Sir, I question that hierarchy. I question even the translation of the terms Nirguna and Saguna. So I see these as two complementary ways of speaking about the nature of the divine. So for me, let me put it briefly, because I've written about this in the book, The Advaita Worldview, but I've also written independently about it. I interpret, or I understand Nirguna, Saad, to mean that to speak of the absolute in its indefinable, transcendent. You know, there is no word that is, Brahman is, as Upanishads themselves say in so many ways, the famous line that I quote, and there are other texts, you know, yato vacho nivartante aprapya manasa saha, that from which all words return, having failed to reach, you know, it is ashabdam, it is soundless, asparsham, you know, it is free from touch. You know, we have, that's what we call in, you know, in theological language, apophatic language, you know, the language of negation, because we can't say what it is. Our words are all our words are our words, and all of our words fall short of the divine. The divine is always more than one can say. One has to acknowledge the finitude of one's symbols and one's language. We should never be arrogant to think that somehow we have enclosed the divine in our symbols and our finite language. So the finitude of language, the word Nirguna reminds us of that. God is free. We need words, we need symbols, but let us not identify the symbol and the reality so completely. That would be a form of idolatry. That would be a form of idolatry. Anything that we say about God, Saad, is God is more. If I said God is love, that's an important way of speaking. But love is only, the word love only describes my experience of love as a human being. How could I ever know what infinite love is? You know, what infinite compassion is? I can't. So we need a language that always reminds us of the limits of our language. And that's where I think, you know, Nirguna, the Nirguna language is important. Let me put Nirguna language that's in the Upanishads is important. But we have Saguna language as well, which speaks about the divine in relationship to the world. God as creator, God as Bhagavad Gita, you know, Pita Hamasya Jagata Mata Dhata Pitamaha. I am the father of the world, I am the mother of the world, I am the grandparent of the world, I am the sustainer of the world, the supporter of the world, the origin and the end of all things. This is Saguna language that describes the one in relationship to the many. But we need a Nirguna language to tell us also that the one is always more than the many. Even in a relationship to the many, let us not limit. So I see Saguna and Nirguna not as lower and higher Brahman, and not as saying that, you know, the Brahman that is unrelated to the world is higher than the Brahman that is related to the world, or the Ishvara. I see this language, Saad, as two sides of a coin, complementary. And coming back, you know, and connecting that to where we were in our discussion earlier, you know, where we see the world alone, or we emphasize the one alone, but we see the one and the many. So Saguna and Nirguna, our language has to be both Saguna and Nirguna. And even then, the one will always be more than anything we say. That is so essential, Saad, for humility also. You know, to know that whenever we speak about the one, we can only speak with humble hearts. We can only speak with reverence. We can only speak with an acknowledgement of a mystery that we would never fully understand. We never fully comprehend. You know, Shankara himself said even the words like Brahman and Atman fall short. As much as those words are used by him and using the Upanishads, he says, but, you know, even all these words fall short. Ultimately, all words fall short. All symbols fall short.
this discussion in your book about the Nirguna and Saguna, and I think for me, it gave me a lot of clarity on this topic. It really puts things in perspective, and of course, you're equating it, or you're striking a parallel with the language of transcendence and immanence. Both are
Yes, yes,
both
yes,
the dimensions have to be emphasized or affirmed at the same time.
yes.
Have one and not the other would be ignorance.
So correct. So Saguna is the language of transcendence, and I would say no. Nirguna is the language of transcendence. I would say Saguna is the language of immanence, and both are necessary.
You also make another really inspiring point, which I found. The need is felt to talk about the Nirguna as higher because creation or any relation is viewed as a limitation. So if God as creator, if God is conceived as creator, then you're speaking of him in relation to the creation, and of course, but you also suggest that the problem only arises if we are thinking of creation in an anthropocentric way or in
Yes,
anthropomorphic way,
yes,
in our way, and
correct.
and so it is important to always add the dimension of the limitless or anantam to whatever we're thinking of God.
Yes, this is so right, Sad, and I think it's a problem on our side, as you properly understood from reading the section of my book where I discuss this, that the assumption that if we speak of God as creator, or we speak of God in relation to the creation, somehow that God becomes limited. We limit the divine when we speak of the divine in relationship. And I don't want to repeat what you beautifully summarized already. I think the flaw there is thinking that somehow the divine in relationship limits the divine. And as I said, that's our anthropocentric imagination at work. Because in the case of the divine, we are always speaking about an infinite reality, about an infinite being. So when we use words like action and so on, attribute such words to the divine, they can't mean the same as when we speak about action on the part of a limited human being. God can be in relationship to the world, but as an infinite reality, that relationship does not have to be construed as limiting the divine. So that's right. Ananta is always present, and you put it very well. Ananta, which means, of course, without end, without limits. We always have to keep that in mind whenever we speak about God.
It would be interesting, Professor, I think, if we could tie this to one attitude which is quite prevalent in our day and in the modern discussion, contemporary discussion on this topic, particularly in India. And this is at the level of popular discussion. Distinction is made between what are popularly known as dharmic religions and Abrahamic religions.
Mm-hmm.
And part of this rhetoric is that Abrahamic religions are, because they invoke a creator God, therefore they represent a primitive state of human mind.
Yes.
And if only they would be more mature, then they would recognize God as Nirguna and beyond creator.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I am aware of that, because I think that yes, and I'm not sure. I have to look at my chapter again, but there are Hindu commentators and Hindu theologians who, coming back to the point, who regard the Nirguna as the higher and Saguna as lower, and see other traditions at a lower level of dealing only with the Saguna on the sign of God, or God as Ishvara, to put it in Sanskrit. And that's true. They also see even other Hindu traditions as stuck with us, especially some of the bhakti traditions that are centered on divine love, as sort of occupying a lower hierarchy because of the Saguna idea. So there are 2 points that I want to make. One is that I think that there is an unfair generalization working here, Saad, because I think that a lot of these traditions, haven't had the opportunity to study and learn about other traditions in the course of my own journey, the Christian tradition and Islam. I know that these traditions also have a deep sense of divine transcendence. What it means, what it means to speak of God as transcending all finite human symbols. So it is not at all that they lack an understanding of the transcendence of God, or that they speak about God only, and somehow they equate finite human symbols with the divine. I think these traditions also have deep theological teachings in their sacred texts and interpretations that affirm divine transcendence. It is also, secondly, I think it is true that they may put a lot of emphasis or put more emphasis on the divine as related to the world, and they do that for different reasons that are connected with their own histories, and we can learn from that. But I will not want to generalize about these traditions. I think these traditions are vast, and they're complex, and they're internally diverse as well. To label them all as Saguna traditions, and to say that the Nirguna traditions are somehow superior, I am completely hesitant to make such generalizations about these traditions. But I'm aware of exactly what you said, and I'm aware of the ways in which they are often spoken of as inferior theologically or philosophically, because of the claim that they don't have a teaching, a Nirguna teaching. But I think this is not true. This is not true.
Can we look at this book, The Limits of Scripture?
Yes.
Swami Vivekananda's reinterpretation of the Vedas. And this is tied to what we were discussing just now, where certain attitudes towards scripture and certain attitudes towards, for example, even the idea of Saguna as representing a lower mindset. Beautifully in this book, you in the first chapter, you trace out the context of that time of in which Swami Vivekananda emerged from Ram Mohan Roy and Arya Samaj, Brahma Samaj, and of course they were influenced by the Unitarian Christians at that time.
Yes.
And a lot of, they have all these common themes and common ways of looking at these things. For example, their attitude towards religion and science, and religion or spirituality was seen as as chiefly scientific activity or endeavor.
Yes.
I think these are quite interesting themes to touch upon.
Yes, Sad. So that book represents, a certain development in my own scholarship. I have deep respect for Swami Vivekananda and for all of his accomplishments, and especially, Sad, I must say, for his compassion and for his attempt to hold the Hindu tradition accountable for responding to suffering in this world. His commitment to life in this world as a monk. So, went through my own studies, traditional studies that I did, a teacher, I discovered the centrality of the pramana. His teaching was centered so much on the nature of the sacred text as a valid source of knowledge, and the way in which, as coming back to our earlier discussion, the way in which this knowledge was direct, and how this knowledge as a direct form of knowledge was liberative in its nature. when I discovered that, and then I found that as I read more contemporary Vedanta writings, the word pramana which was so central to the classical Hindu theological thinking, that this word was very rarely used. I wanted to understand why. What happened? Where did we lose, the centrality of the theology of the scriptures as pramana? So then I went back and you just summarized some of the history, more recent history about attitudes to the scripture, starting with the Brahmo Samaj, and then the rejection of the authority of the Veda within the circles of the Brahmo Samaj, and as you said, all of the debates about science, because science was really very, very important in the 19th century, and so many teachers were adopting the language of science, and therefore they found that the authority of scripture was somehow now not consistent with the scientific worldview. Whereas I found, and I was thinking, but pramana is not inconsistent with the use of reason or scholarship, rationality. It was a very rational way of thinking about valid sources of knowledge. So I wanted to understand what were the developments in the contemporary period that led to this sidelining or of this neglect of Sruti or scripture as pramana. And in this book, that's what I seek to explore. And I do it by contrasting the attitude of one of the most important teachers in modern times, Swami Vivekananda, with Adi Shankara, the classical theologian, especially because most of the scholars were saying that there's no difference in attitude to the scripture between Shankara and Vivekananda. And I was not seeing it in that way. So I wanted to highlight this point, but also, Saad, to comment more broadly on what I regard as some of the unfortunate consequences for Hindu scholarship and reflection that came about through a loss of the centrality of scripture or Sruti as pramana. And this is what I explore in this. This is what I was exploring in this work.
Right. Right. I think that book has much broader implications, because perhaps we can use the term Neo Vedanta to refer to that kind of trend, which is divorced from scholarship. Or I don't want to generalize, but there's certainly a large segment which is taking this trend, which is divorced from scholarship and from tradition and from a historicity.
Yes.
And
yes, I think so. I am troubled. I must admit that that I often hear a denunciation of scholarship, a denunciation of the life of the mind, a denunciation of reason in the name of spirituality that disturbs me profoundly, because I look to a tradition, a classical tradition, where these were not considered as rivals, where these did not exclude each other, where the life of the mind and the life of spirituality, the life of the spirit, are wedded together, and they are mutually supportive. They don't exclude each other. Whereas I am unfortunately hearing approaches that represent these as a dichotomy, or even hierarchically. And I see reason as a great gift. It's sad.
No, I just want to mention one point here, Professor. In this book, this is something it reminded me of this point when I was reading The Limits of Scripture, that many modern day neo-Vedantic or general neo-spiritual teachers speak of the mind as something to be opposed or something to be transcendent, whereas you say that it is something we should appreciate.
Yes.
And this language that you're trying to see it as a negative thing.
Yes.
Thoughts are a negative thing, or I mean,
Yes,
there is, of course, a point to what they're trying to say. They're trying to
yes,
divert your attention to the witnesser, but
yes, yes.
the,
I mean,
the physiology is problematic, of course. Yeah.
it's a good point. All of the analogies speak about controlling the mind. Making sure that the mind is free from greed and free from anger and free from hate. The purification of the mind, but not its negation. Even for liberation, it's a beautiful instrument, especially when it is cleansed from avidya and the consequences of avidya, which include, as I said, karma, krodha, greed, anger, dvesha, hate for others, mamatva, possessiveness, and so on. But that we should kill the mind. It's a characteristic of this. It's a discourse that I don't find to be rooted in the deep sacred text or in a classical tradition, which commend the transformed mind and not the mind that is negated.
One final question, if I may, Professor.
Yes.
I mean, of course, there's a lot that I regret not having had asked you.
We can come back another day.
Of course. Yeah. The subtitle of your book, A Hindu Theology of Liberation, not one
Yeah.
is not two. And you have a discussion in the limits of scripture that many paths lead to one. Famous line, Ikam Sat Vipraha Bahuda Vedanti. Truth is one, the wise. The sages call it by many names. There is of course, there is an obvious truth to that saying. And of course, there's an obvious truth to how it is used. But there's also a problematic aspect in how it is applied in certain modern contexts.
Yes.
Where in the name of truth or in the name of unity, multiplicity and diversity and differences are whitewashed.
Yes. Yes. I agree with you, Sarah. In fact, I should share with you, some things that I've written on this particular Rig Veda text that you quote. Ekam sat vipraha bahuda vadanti. Among the things that I say about this statement is calling attention to vipraha bahuda vadanti, that the wise speak differently. In other words, that there is wisdom often in different speech and diversity. It is not foolish people who are speaking differently. It is vipraha, wise people who are speaking differently. And if wise people speak differently, as the text says, then we should be attentive to difference. We should not, because by homogenizing, we lose a lot of wisdom. By homogenizing, we lose the insights of different speech. So I don't read this important line, because in fact, we should see it in proper context, what precedes it and what follows it. We often quote, the one line from it, Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti, but there's an interesting prelude to this sentence. But so rather than overlooking difference, I read this text as commending attentiveness to difference, because it is wise people who speak differently. It is not the agyani speaking differently, but vipraha bahuda vadanti. So when we hear a different speech, or we encounter a different tradition, we should not dismiss it because it is different from what we know. We should be attentive to it. We should be attentive to it. And at the same time, there is the other fundamental insight of this line, Saad, is that, which means a lot to me, is that I don't have to think, because I hold firmly to the conviction that the divine is one, ekam sat. That's how the line begins, ekam sat. The truth is one, the divine is one, ekam sat. Because I hold on to that truth, on the basis of this particular text, I don't think of a Christian God or a Muslim God or a Jewish God. Yes, there are distinctive, there's a Bahuda, there's a distinctive Christian understanding or Christian understandings of this one, and there are insightful Muslim understandings, Islamic understandings, or Jewish understandings from which I could learn. But I'm learning about the one. I'm learning about the one. And because it is the one, I have a relationship also with every Muslim, with every Christian, with every Jew. Through that one, I am united with them all, because that one is the source of us all. That one is the sustenance of us all. That one is our ultimate point of return. And through that one, I am in relationship with all of my brothers and sisters in this world.
And that one is also the object of all of our quests, all of our seeking.
Correct.
We have multifarious ways of seeking it.
I agree with you. It's a common object of our quest, and we will not find fulfillment unless we discover or rediscover our relationship with the one.
I think that's a good note to end this on, Professor.
Thank you
so much for your time.
Thank you. I enjoyed meeting you. It's still morning here. Sad meeting you and having this conversation with you. And I, again, what I said before, I appreciate deeply your interest in these subjects and your care in reading what I have written. I have a new book that will come out in the new year, because as you've seen in my biography, I spent a lot of my life in dialogue with others, and in a special way because of where I'm located and my own history with the Christian tradition and with Christian friends. And so I have this book draws a lot of those experiences and thoughts together. So it's called Pathways to Hindu-Christian Dialogue. It will be published by maybe late spring, early summer of this year. Maybe we could have a conversation about that.
So before we sign off, I'd just like to, for the viewers, I'd just like to show a few of your books. The one which we discussed today was, of course, the Advaita Worldview, God, World, and Humanity. And the other one which also came up in our discussions is The Limits of Scripture, Vivekananda's reinterpretation of the Vedas. And I think the last one which you came out with was Essays in Hindu Theology.
That's correct, yes.
And I think this is quite it is beautifully simple and straightforward, compared to your other book, for example.
Thank you.
I mean,
but most of these were based on like public lectures that I gave. So I tried. You're right. I tried to write this book I would like to keep on writing like that, and I think the Pathways to Hindu-Christian Dialogue is. I try to be more intentional about accessibility in the style of writing.
Right, and of course you also have I think a whole series of really short booklets, which I got hold of one.
Yeah, so these again, Saad, come out of more because I like to function also as a public teacher, as a public theologian, not simply in the silos of the academic world, because in my own self-understanding, while I am a theological scholar in my tradition, most important, I'm also a practitioner. of my tradition, and that is more important in so many ways. My scholarship serves my life as a practitioner and as a learner from people of other traditions.
Your example is certainly one which beautifully tries to bridge spirituality and scholarship, and tries to guide us, serve as a guide in balancing both the aspects. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.